This morning we're celebrating and remembering Mothering Sunday, for which we no doubt come with a range of feelings and images in our minds. Perhaps, it will differ for each of us. As I remember my mum, and it's good to remember something of that thoughtfulness and care and encouragement and gifts, or just something of her smile, which she may be watching this morning, so I might see her on Zoom later on today, ways of catching up. There's something which comes back to us, and at least some of us experiences one that makes us smile and remember with thanksgiving this day. Of course, I'm aware that that's not quite the same for everyone, and some it's a mix of emotions, perhaps those remembering mothers who are no longer with us, perhaps those who died in this last year may be filled with that mixture of thankfulness, but also grief. There'll be others who haven't known their mothers, or whose mums have not been as good as they might have been. There'll be some who've longed to be mothers, but that hasn't worked out, and so this day brings a whole mix of things. It's a day which reminds us of goodness, and yet also of difficulties and challenges. Maybe it's appropriate that the first reading set is that story of Moses' mother, who's Jochebed. Her name isn't given in the reading, in case you're wondering. You have to search a bit elsewhere to find her name, but Jochebed, obviously a very practical and caring lady, developing and having a family in a place in which there were many difficulties. It was a time of political oppression, as the people of Israel had grown to such a size that they were a threat. And hence the pharaohs had decided to take extreme measures in saying they would kill off all the newborn sons. There is a situation of extreme violence and difficulty and challenge. And it struck me as I was reading that the way forward for Jochebed was to be silent. That was her approach. She was quiet about having the baby. She tried to keep Moses quiet as a way of protection, as a way of care. Of course, it was linked to a faith in God's goodness. So it was a silence, but it was also a turning to God, knowing the God who had rescued them and would meet with them again. The silence as a way to goodness, even through oppression. Of course, it's an example that seems to stand out in its starkness as we hear continuing stories from Ukraine. And maybe some of those stories of mothers there, the amazing story about a week ago of the mother shielding her baby as the rockets came through into the building, taking a lot of the results of that herself in order to protect her child. Or maybe those stories of mothers who fled the country, taking their children with them, often, of course, having to leave husbands or partners behind, particularly if they were going to be signed up to fight. There's stories, aren't there, which make this story of the Bible a little more resonant, that in the midst of a world of violence, what is the way forward? It both reinforces the problems, the difficulties, the challenges, and yet also the assurance of goodness. As God answered Jochebed's prayer in an unusual way in rescuing Moses. And of course, there's an awful lot more to the story. Silence as a way forward. It's in the Christian tradition, there's a lot about silence and the positive nature of silence, particularly in the life of prayer. Taking time to be silent, both outwardly, finding a way of shutting ourselves up, and inwardly, in terms of trying to sort of quieten down the raging of our minds and hearts, is part of what's often called contemplative prayer. Taking time of silence in order to discover something more of God. As it happens, there was a deanery minister's quiet day this week, and I went along and confessed to one or two other ministers there that I was really too busy to be there. And of course they also said, yes, so are we, but we felt we ought to come because we keep talking about prayer, and hence we really ought to turn up and pray. It's one of those realities. It's sometimes easier to say, I'm busy and keep going than it is to make time to be silent. And the day was filled with just short reflections, and then sort of 45 minutes of quiet, and then maybe coffee breaks, and onto another time of silence. And it was a time of just being quiet. But of course, you find when you're quiet that the mind then sort of rolls around faster, with the things that need doing, or, how are we going to get a treasurer? What sort of things is going to be the next week? And so sometimes the anxieties for me sort of come to the fore. So sometimes I avoid silence because it's easier to keep busy than to face all those other voices that are there. But the need was there, and I needed to be quiet. And in the midst of that, something of God's voice. And the speaker was talking about the story of Jonah, of course, going in the wrong direction, but God leading him back into the right place. But even there, he struggled. There was something about the struggle of life, and yet that's where we find God's goodness. And that's shone through for me from that time of silence. Silence is a place of honesty and hope. It's an important part that we need to build into our lives. So silence may be positive as a way through dear times of oppression. It may be a positive place of honesty and goodness in prayer. It may also, of course, silence can be a challenge. There's something about the challenge of silence which is found in that gospel reading of that woman with the flow of blood. She would have been excluded from the community because of the medical condition. It was made her unclean. So not only was she there with an illness, but she was also there excluded from others. She was into enforced silence. She was kept quiet. It's a negative silence. And the church or religious institutions are not, don't escape from forcing silence where it shouldn't be there. And it's interesting just to note the approach of Jesus in this place. We're doing a series on pastoral principles, which is about how we live together with difference. And so the topic for today was speaking into silence. So it's guided me to sort of look at the readings in a different way, and maybe that's a good thing. And I've just noticed in that gospel reading, Jesus really helps the woman to face and draw out what was going on. Most healings, Jesus tries to sort of play them down. Don't tell anyone. Just be quiet. Don't cause a fuss. Let's not create a rush of people. But here, unusually, Jesus draws attention to the woman. Who touched me? And waited really until the lady had come and had spoken. There's something there of the woman who was speaking. She had to speak out what had been silenced. She had to say how she'd been treated, and yet how in Jesus she'd met something of God's goodness. There's something about speaking out and protest that is needed when silence is forced. I was talking to, Dorothy isn't here this morning, I was talking to her the other week about the women's liberation movement in the 1960s. I won't embarrass her because she's not here, but she was saying of some of the forms that protest took in the 1960s. I have to say I was quite young in the 60s, so I didn't, some of you may know it better than me. But she was just saying, in terms of women being often feeling and being silenced and not being given the recognition needed, which is still a challenge today, let's be honest, how the protest was needed, how words needed to come rather than just silently going on with the way things were. We think about the protests over race. Think of Sir George Floyd was killed, just the worldwide protest which said, this is not right. How can we treat people this way? The need for voices, not just leaving those kind of incidents silent. Or, of course, in the pastoral principles, which is focusing partly on sexuality and gender and issues that often in church life and generally are kept silent. How many people do you know who may identify themselves as gay or trans who feel they can't say something in church, just as an example? Often it's the way and the patterns of relating that keep people silent, not always because we're out to do wrong or bad, but just simply there are patterns. Or maybe we're just not familiar with the stories of others, but it's so central to their identity, and hence we need a way of speaking. Because some people have said to me, well, when's the church going to stop talking about sexuality? You know, it's kind of been on it for an awful long time. And maybe it's overdone it and there are other issues we need to hear about. But actually there are issues to do with sexuality we need to speak out about still. We are not too far on the journey. Silence sometimes needs challenging with protest. So this morning, as we think on Mothering Sunday in a wider picture really, so maybe we're remembering our mothers and the good things, the things to be thankful of. Maybe we're remembering our mums or those who've acted as mothers to us, who've been those who've protested what is wrong. Maybe we need to give thanks for the women who protest, the women who inspire us by their care for others in places of oppression and violence. And maybe we can just take note of these readings, which encourage us not on an easy journey, but a journey that's really inspired by the goodness of others and ultimately the goodness of God. To keep going, to keep open, to be appropriately silent and appropriately protesting in words, that this world may continue and grow to be a better place than it is at the moment. So may the Lord grant us that heart of love, of silence, of goodness and of protest for Jesus' sake. Amen.